Mid-Atlantic, 1945. The sea is calm, the horizon a cold silver line beneath the morning haze. A U.S. Navy transport vessel cuts through the swell, carrying a small group of captured German naval officers, men who once served aboard the Kriegsmarine's proudest ships. Their uniforms are worn, insignias removed, eyes cautious. When the ship slows, they look ahead and see it, an American aircraft carrier, anchored like a continent of steel. It seems impossible. Towering decks, cranes, and elevators rising above the waves. Dozens of aircraft line the flight deck, wings folded neatly, sunlight flashing on their canopies. The wind hums against the hull, the sound like distant thunder. They are led aboard. The deck trembles as engines roar below. Beneath the surface, corridors stretch endlessly. Workshops, machine rooms, a galley feeding thousands, even a barber chair bolted to the floor. The air smells of oil, metal, and coffee. It is not a ship. It is a floating city. One German officer whispers almost reverently, "It's a factory of war." He is not wrong. Within these walls, America has built something beyond strategy, a civilization capable of waging war from the sea itself. And this realization would change how the world understood power. Before the Second World War began, the oceans still belonged to the battleship. In the minds of admirals from London to Berlin, naval power meant towering gun turrets, thick armor belts, and broadsides that could tear through steel. Ships like Bismarck, Yamato, and Hood were built as floating fortresses, symbols of industrial might and national pride. Aircraft were still considered auxiliary tools, useful for scouting but not decisive in combat. The German Kriegsmarine, led by Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, subscribed to this orthodoxy. His dream fleet, outlined in Plan Z, called for massive battleships, cruisers, and submarines. The idea of an aircraft carrier was a footnote, an experiment. Germany's lone attempt, the Graf Zeppelin, was laid down in 1936 but never completed. Hitler's priorities, steel shortages, and skepticism toward naval aviation, stalled it permanently. The United States, however, was thinking differently. Between the wars, a handful of U.S. naval officers, and among them Admirals William Moffett, Ernest King, and later Chester Nimitz, quietly transformed naval doctrine. They studied air power's potential, running exercises in the Pacific and Atlantic with experimental carriers like USS Langley, Lexington, and Saratoga. They discovered what traditional admirals refused to see, that aircraft could strike beyond the horizon, delivering blows no battleship could match. The world would not grasp the significance of this until December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor was not just an attack, and it was a revelation. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers launched 353 planes in a coordinated strike that crippled the American Pacific Fleet in 2 hours. The battleships were left burning hulks. But the 3 U.S. carriers stationed at sea, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, survived. And with them, so did the future of American naval warfare. In the months that followed, the U.S. Navy turned its surviving carriers into mobile strongholds. The Yorktown, Hornet, and Enterprise led desperate counterstrikes, from the Doolittle raid on Tokyo to the Battle of Midway. At Midway in June 1942, carrier-based aircraft became the decisive factor in battle for the first time in history. American dive bombers, launched from hundreds of miles away, found and destroyed 4 Japanese carriers within minutes. The age of the battleship was over. The age of the aircraft carrier had begun. But what truly set America apart was not just tactical success, and it was scale. The U.S. war industry turned the concept of the aircraft carrier into an industrial phenomenon. By 1943, American shipyards were launching new Essex-class carriers every few months, an engineering and logistical miracle. These were not experimental ships or fragile prototypes. Each was a 27,000-ton fortress of steel, and 2 feet long, crewed by over 3,000 men, and capable of launching 90 to 100 aircraft. Their design embodied self-sufficiency. Below decks, machine shops, radio rooms, and workshops allowed constant repair and adaptation. Massive elevators lifted aircraft from the hangar to the flight deck in seconds. Fuel lines, ammunition hoists, and radar systems operated with mechanical precision. The ship was divided into dozens of specialized zones: navigation, engineering, communications, mess halls, medical wards, each functioning like a department of a small city. A carrier did not simply fight. It lived. The galleys served thousands of meals a day: eggs, coffee, bread, meat, supplied by refrigerated holds deep below. The laundry processed tons of uniforms each week. The sickbay had its own surgeons and operating tables. There were post offices, chapels, and even small stores. The American carrier was designed not merely to operate at sea, but to exist there and for weeks, even months, without resupply. To German officers trained in the tradition of heavy cruisers and U-boats, this was unthinkable. At the height of the war, the contrast between the two naval philosophies could not have been sharper. The German Navy's pride, the battleship Bismarck, had been sunk in May 1941, before it ever saw an aircraft carrier in action. When it fell beneath the waves, it marked more than a tactical loss. It symbolized the obsolescence of the entire battleship age. Germany's only carrier project, Graf Zeppelin, sat incomplete in Stettin shipyard, her hangars empty, her decks silent. Plans for her air group, 42 fighters and bombers, were never realized. She became a steel skeleton of what might have been, overshadowed by the Allies' advancing naval technology. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the U.S. Navy operated entire task forces centered around carriers, each one escorted by destroyers, cruisers, and supply ships, all linked by radio and radar. These groups could coordinate air operations across hundreds of miles. Every man aboard knew his role in the machine. The Germans called it Die, Fliegende Festung, the flying fortress of the sea axis. Intelligence officers tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. Captured reports from 1943 described American carriers as industrial colonies. Afloat, their writers were astonished not only by the ships themselves, but by the infrastructure supporting them: fleets of oilers, supply convoys, and repair ships that followed the carriers across the ocean like mobile cities. One German report admitted, "Where we possess ships, the Americans possess systems. Their ships live not alone but as organs of a greater whole." That observation was the essence of the American advantage. For the United States, a carrier was not an isolated weapon. It was a node in a vast logistical organism. From the factories in Michigan that built engines, to the women in Iowa packing rations, to the pilots training in Florida, every piece connected back to the carrier. When one sailed, an entire nation moved with it. This unity between industry, engineering, and human organization created a kind of power the Axis could not replicate. By 1944, the scale was incomprehensible. The United States operated more than 100 carriers, ranging from the giant Essex class to smaller escort carriers that ferried aircraft and protected convoys. At their peak, the Pacific Carrier Task Forces could project over 1,000 aircraft at once, a flying armada launched from the sea. Each carrier's internal structure functioned with the discipline of a city government. Deck divisions handled launches and landings. Engineering maintained power and propulsion. Supply crews oversaw vast storerooms. Even waste management, sanitation, and freshwater production were industrial in scope. Every man aboard, and from captain to cook, played a role in sustaining life at sea. The hum of machines, the rhythm of daily drills, the smell of aviation fuel and paint, the constant vibration of engines, it all created an environment as alive as any metropolis on land. And in that environment, the U.S. Navy learned to synchronize thousands of human actions into a single continuous operation: launching, fueling, arming, feeding, repairing one without pause. To outsiders, it looked like perfection. To those aboard, it was survival through order. When German officers finally witnessed an American carrier up close, late in the war or after, surrender, they described it with a mix of awe and disbelief. They could not fathom how such a ship could function. To them, it was a paradox, a vessel of war that looked like a civilization. A post-war report from a captured Kriegsmarine engineer read, "Everything within the ship was living, a machine made of men and metal. It could strike from the sea like a city moving upon the water." It was not only technology, it was organization raised to art. That art had been forged not in peace, but in desperation, the desperate need to project power across oceans to avenge Pearl Harbor and to defeat an enemy spread over half the globe. The aircraft carrier had become the centerpiece of that mission, a self-contained world of steel that turned industrial democracy into naval supremacy. And soon, its full potential would be revealed in the massive air battles that defined the end of the Pacific War, where the sky itself would become an extension of the carrier's decks. Before dawn, a carrier at sea feels like a sleeping city. A low hum rises from the decks. Engines turning over, ventilation fans spinning, the deep pulse of turbines echoing through steel walls. In the dim red light of the hangar bay, mechanics move like silhouettes among rows of aircraft. The smell of oil and salt hangs thick in the air. Then comes the call. Flight operations commencing. The city awakens. Elevators lift planes to the deck. Wings unfold with mechanical grace, and ordnance crews roll bombs and torpedoes across the planks. Every motion follows a pattern drilled into memory. Pilots, faces drawn in quiet, climb into cockpits. The air boss watches from the island tower, headset pressed to his ear, his voice carrying through loudspeakers. Launch 1. The roar begins, one by one. Propellers spin, throttles open, and aircraft leap from the deck into the sky. From above, the carrier task force looks like an organism. Destroyers fanning out in protective rings. Cruisers scanning radar screens. Submarines trailing silently below. Everything moves in harmony. No part can fail. To those who lived aboard, this was not just a ship. It was a city that breathed, fought, and repaired itself without pause. The German officers who first saw these operations, whether through captured film, observation reports, or post-war visits, were stunned by the rhythm and precision. In their own navy, order was strict, but it was mechanical. Obedience bound by hierarchy. The American carrier, by contrast, thrived on coordination born from trust. The crew was disciplined yet flexible. Its strength lay in collective competence, not rigid command. A German naval attaché reviewing intelligence reports in 1944 wrote with disbelief, "Their carriers are cities, not ships. They house every trade, every profession, mechanics, bakers, doctors, even priests. It is not an army, it is a civilization in uniform." He wasn't exaggerating. On a U.S. carrier, nearly every skill on land had a counterpart at sea. There were metalworkers who repaired battle damage, electricians who rewired radar arrays, photographers who documented missions, meteorologists predicting weather, cooks feeding thousands, and surgeons saving lives. Each deck, corridor, and compartment was a neighborhood in this floating world. The mess deck smelled of coffee and fried eggs. The radio rooms buzzed with Morse code. The machine shops rang with the metallic rhythm of hammers. And yet, despite its size, the entire carrier could shift from routine to battle readiness in seconds. The heart of the ship was the flight deck. The most dangerous workplace in the world. Every man there knew that one mistake could mean death. A propeller strike, a dropped bomb, or a landing gone wrong. The deck crews, often called deck gangs, wore color-coded shirts. Yellow for officers, blue for handlers, green for maintenance, red for ordnance, purple for fuel. The colors formed a living chart of function and hierarchy. In daylight, they operated with practiced calm. At night, under red lamps, they worked by instinct. A single carrier could launch a plane every 30 seconds, recover one every 45. Coordinating that required the precision of a clock and the endurance of a city that never slept. From above, a carrier in full operation looked almost unreal. Smoke rising, planes circling, waves breaking against steel. For German officers accustomed to battleships firing salvos, this new rhythm of warfare, the orchestration of hundreds of aircraft, each an extension of the ship's will, was almost incomprehensible. The carrier didn't fire its weapons directly. It commanded the sky. Below the deck, the human life of the ship unfolded in layers. The engine rooms glowed orange from turbine heat. The galley ran around the clock, thousands of meals per day, coffee before dawn, beans and rice at noon, powdered potatoes and canned fruit at night. The post office sorted letters carried from across the Pacific. A ship's band played on Sundays. There were chapels, barber chairs, and even a small printing press for daily bulletins. These details, small as they seemed, were deliberate. They kept morale steady in a world of steel and confinement. In wartime films shown to Axis POWs after 1943, scenes of this life, the order, the rhythm, the normalcy amid chaos, and left many visibly shaken. For them, naval war had meant cold bunks, strict rationing, and constant fear. Here aboard a U.S. carrier, it meant a strange combination of industry and humanity. The American Navy understood something deeper, that a crew was not a machine. It was a society. Every society has its infrastructure, and the carrier's was staggering. It generated its own power, water, and air. It stored millions of gallons of fuel, both for the ship and for its planes. It could repair its own hull, rebuild damaged aircraft, and even perform surgeries while under attack. Its communication systems and radios, radar, and signal towers allowed it to coordinate operations across hundreds of miles. When radar detected incoming enemy planes, alarms rippled through the ship instantly. Gunners sprinted to their stations, pilots prepped for intercept. Within minutes, the entire city turned from peace to combat readiness, and when the air raid passed, it went back to order. Meals served, shifts rotated, tools repaired. German naval intelligence reports during 1944, based on intercepted transmissions, estimated that an American Essex-class carrier could sustain operations for over 90 consecutive days without external support. They compared it to a colony adrift, powered by discipline and industry. They weren't far off. Even the flow of information aboard the ship mirrored a functioning city government. Orders came from the bridge, filtered through departments, executed by specialists. Coordination depended on intercoms, runners, and coded signals. A single message from the captain could activate over 1,000 men. At the heart of this command network was the Combat Information Center, a darkened chamber lined with glowing radar screens, maps, and sound-powered phones. Here, officers tracked aircraft in real time, directing fighters and bombers like a city's air traffic system. This nerve center was one of the most advanced operations environments of the war. Its data systems allowed carriers to see beyond the horizon, detect threats, and coordinate dozens of aircraft simultaneously. For the Germans, whose naval communications relied heavily on radio and visual spotting, this level of technological integration was unimaginable. It wasn't just a ship. It was an intelligence organism. Yet beneath all the machinery, what astonished observers most was the human choreography. German naval officers were used to small crews, tight, efficient, but limited. On an American carrier, over 3,000 men moved with the precision of a living mechanism. When German POWs were transported aboard carriers late in the war, many remarked not on the weapons but on the behavior. Crews smiled, saluted, joked, and worked without panic even under air alerts. It wasn't arrogance. It was confidence built on routine. A captured officer later recalled, "We saw no chaos, no shouting. Only motion, ordered, continuous, silent except for the engines." They were not fighting a battle. They were conducting a process. That process was war industrialized. Every man was a worker in a vast, moving factory. Each bomber sortie was a product. Each recovery, a reloading cycle. The ship's efficiency reflected the American ethos, the marriage of engineering and organization. The complexity extended to logistics. Each carrier depended on a chain of support stretching thousands of miles, tankers refueling at sea, supply ships transferring ammunition and food mid-ocean. These underway replenishments, ships sailing side by side while cranes swung crates between them and were feats of coordination that left Axis observers astonished. For German crews who struggled to resupply even coastal raiders, this was science fiction made real, and then there was scale. The Americans operated entire task forces of carriers, each one linked by radio and radar into a mobile war grid. A single task force could carry more aircraft than many nations' entire air forces. To an Axis intelligence analyst in 1944, it looked less like a fleet and more like a moving nation. But life aboard these cities was not without hardship. Space was tight. Temperatures in the engine rooms could exceed 110 degrees. The smell of oil and sweat never left. Men slept inches apart in narrow bunks, the thrum of engines always beneath them. The decks trembled with every launch. Accidents were frequent. A single misplaced signal or mechanical failure could ignite aviation fuel or detonate munitions. Fires spread fast. Training and discipline were the only safeguards. When disaster struck, as it did on the USS Franklin in 1945, when bombs detonated on the deck, the ship's ability to function as a city saved it. Hundreds fought flames for hours, doctors treated burns amid smoke, cooks became stretcher bearers. Out of a crew of nearly 3,000, more than 800 died, but the carrier stayed afloat, proof that even wounded, the city endured. To those who survived, the lesson was clear. A carrier was not invincible, but it was resilient in a way no other warship could be. The psychological impact on the Axis was profound. German naval intelligence had once dismissed the carrier as fragile. A single bomb could sink it. By 1944, that notion was gone. They understood that the carrier's power lay not in armor, but in regeneration. It could take damage, adapt, and fight again. Captured documents later revealed how German engineers studying post-war wrecks of Japanese carriers were astounded by their American counterparts' durability. The American obsession with redundancy, multiple generators, duplicate systems, layered damage control, was an industrial philosophy, not merely a design feature. Every part of the ship had a backup. Every function could continue under duress. A post-war German report summarized it simply: their carriers were not ships. They were ecosystems. By late 1944, even the German High Command, now isolated and desperate, recognized that the Allies' naval power had become untouchable. The Atlantic was an American domain. The Pacific, once Japan's empire, had become an American highway of carriers. German officers read reports from their Japanese allies describing U.S. carrier operations at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Waves of fighters and bombers launched in endless succession, refueled, rearmed, and relaunched in under an hour. The Japanese called it the machine that does not tire. From Berlin's bunkers, such accounts must have sounded like reports from another planet. For the men who built, manned, and maintained those carriers, however, it was not magic, it was method. Each carrier functioned on systems of planning, communication, and trust honed through endless repetition. Behind the thunder of aircraft and artillery was a quiet rhythm. Engineers checking gauges, cooks washing trays, radar operators tracking dots on screens, signalmen flashing lamps into the night. Every man contributed to something larger than himself, a world afloat, balanced between order and chaos. To step aboard such a ship was to enter a new kind of civilization, one forged not by geography, but by machinery and willpower. And it was this civilization that the captured German officers finally stood inside, eyes wide, understanding for the first time that they had lost not just the war, but the race to modernity itself. The carrier was no longer an experiment. It had become the embodiment of 20th century power, a weapon of industry, organization and endurance, and the Axis, built on ideology and hierarchy, had been defeated by something more subtle and more profound: the disciplined complexity of democracy at sea. June 19, 1944, Western Pacific. The morning sky above the Philippine Sea shimmered like glass. From horizon to horizon stretched the largest concentration of naval power the world had ever seen. 15 American aircraft carriers, 6 battleships, scores of cruisers, destroyers, oilers, and supply ships. An entire nation of steel, floating in formation. On their decks, more than 900 aircraft sat waiting, engines warmed, propellers spun. Flight crews shouted above the roar. Below, deep inside those steel cities, machinists tightened bolts, radar operators tracked faint echoes on phosphor screens, and cooks ladled coffee into tin mugs for men who hadn't slept in days. It was the beginning of the battle of the Philippine Sea, the moment when the full might of the American carrier civilization would reveal itself to the world. To the Japanese, this was Operation Ago, a desperate attempt to crush the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single decisive engagement. To the Americans, it was routine efficiency on a cosmic scale. And to the German officers who later studied this battle from intercepted reports and captured Japanese logs, what they saw defied comprehension. The German Kriegsmarine had once dreamed of such control, vast fleets sweeping across oceans, but had never imagined anything like this. From their airfields hundreds of miles away, the Japanese launched 4 massive waves of aircraft toward the American fleet. Radar aboard the carriers detected them long before they came into sight. The combat information centers lit up with blips, voices steady over radios. Bandits inbound. Bearing 270. Fighter directors issued calm commands. On the flight decks, Hellcats were armed, fueled and catapulted into the sky with mechanical precision. Within minutes, the blue Pacific was filled with spinning propellers and streaking contrails, American fighters climbing to intercept, Japanese bombers diving through sunlight and flak. The scale of coordination was breathtaking. Each carrier's air group was controlled like an orchestra. Takeoff, altitude, formation, attack, recovery, all synchronized through radio, radar, and procedure. It was not chaos. It was choreography. For the Japanese pilots who reached the fleet, the sight below was surreal. Waves breaking against colossal decks, anti-aircraft fire erupting in a wall of flame and smoke. Radar-guided guns tracked their paths, and proximity fuses detonated shells mid-air with lethal accuracy. The Americans had turned technology into instinct. By evening, more than 350 Japanese aircraft had been shot down. American losses fewer than 30. It would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a massacre in the sky, and the death knell of Japanese naval aviation. But for German analysts reviewing battle reports months later, what fascinated them wasn't the victory itself. It was how it was achieved. They pored over captured documents describing the combat information centers, the radar-controlled fire, the seamless refueling and rearming of aircraft, the constant replenishment at sea. To them, it was an alien form of war, one fought by systems rather than heroes. One German admiral, reading those reports in 1945, scribbled in the margins, "They have made their ships into continents. Each one sustains itself, produces, commands, defends. It is not naval warfare. It is a mobile industrial complex." At Midway 2 years earlier, the world had seen the aircraft carrier's potential. In the Philippine Sea, it saw perfection. In the space of a single day, the U.S. Navy demonstrated total mastery of combined warfare. Radar-guided interception, logistics ships refueled under combat conditions, and medical teams treated the wounded while new sorties launched above them. Aboard USS Lexington, radar operators tracked hundreds of blips while mess stewards served dinner 3 decks below. A mechanic replaced a landing hook while overhead another plane took off. The ship never stopped. It simply adapted. That was the secret and continuity. The American carrier was not designed to dominate a single battle. It was designed to fight forever. When the German naval attachés in Tokyo sent back intelligence on American carriers earlier in the war, Berlin had treated the reports with skepticism. The scale sounded exaggerated. Now, after the Philippine Sea, the evidence was undeniable. American carriers operated as interdependent systems. Task Force 58 under Admiral Mark Mitcher was effectively a floating metropolis. Its flagship, USS Lexington, commanded air groups spread across hundreds of miles. Each group, Yorktown, Hornet, Enterprise, Bunker Hill, Essex, functioned like a city district. One focused on interception, another on strikes, another on rescue and recovery. When fuel ran low, oilers moved in. When planes were damaged, they were cannibalized for parts. When pilots ditched at sea, destroyers plucked them from the water in minutes. The entire structure operated with a reliability that stunned the world. German engineers marveled at the supply chains feeding it. Oil from California, aircraft from Detroit, radar from Massachusetts, all flowing seamlessly to the Pacific. It was not just war. It was logistics raised to a religion. When Japan's fleet finally broke and retreated, the Americans did not celebrate. They refueled. Crews washed the decks, repaired arresting cables, and stacked ammunition for the next day. Below decks, typewriters clattered in the ship's administration rooms. The city still functioned. The contrast between that calm order and the chaos of Axis warfare could not have been more striking. German naval officers, hardened veterans of the North Atlantic, were astonished by reports of how little panic there was aboard American carriers even under attack. Fire crews trained endlessly. Water mains and foam nozzles reached every compartment. Electrical circuits were redundant. Compartments sealed automatically when breached. One post-war German report observed, "They have learned to remove fear from machinery. Every system can fail, but the system as a whole will survive." That idea that survival could be engineered was alien to a generation of European militaries raised on the myth of individual valor. The Americans, by contrast, had built a machine that absorbed chaos and turned it into order. For the Axis alliance, that realization arrived too late. The Japanese fleet, their last hope, was shattered. In a single day, the Empire's naval air arm was reduced to ash and oil. American carriers swept forward toward Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. From Berlin, Admiral Dönitz received the reports with grim silence. His submarines were being hunted to extinction. The Atlantic had become an American-controlled sea. He had once believed that battleships and U-boats would dominate the oceans for a century. Now he saw that the future belonged to the sky, and to the vast floating cities that controlled it. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, surviving naval officers were interrogated and debriefed. Many were taken aboard Allied ships for observation. One group of former Kriegsmarine officers escorted aboard the USS Saratoga found themselves speechless. They had studied diagrams of these ships for years, but standing on the deck, hearing the rumble of elevators and the hum of turbines, was something else entirely. They wandered through endless corridors, workshops full of sparks and metal, kitchens serving meals for thousands, a chapel where sailors prayed, a medical bay with surgeons preparing for the next sortie. Everywhere they looked, there was purpose. A German engineer muttered half to himself, "This is not a vessel. This is a world." He was right. The experience shocked even men who had served on the Bismarck and Tirpitz. The Bismarck had been a fortress, mighty, isolated, built for glory. The American carrier was the opposite, decentralized, collaborative, designed for endurance. Where the German ships carried prestige, the American ones carried continuity. Every process was repeatable, every task replaceable. It was industrial war made human, the democratization of combat through organization. That was what unnerved the Axis officers most. Not the scale of the carrier, but the mindset behind it. A battleship reflected a single idea: strength through armor. A carrier reflected an entire culture: strength through cooperation. During the final months of 1945, Allied investigators allowed German engineers to study captured Japanese carriers at Kure and Yokosuka. The devastation was immense: twisted decks, scorched hangars, bombed hulls. But alongside them lay American carriers, fully operational, running their generators and feeding their crews. The contrast was irrefutable. One of the German technical teams wrote in a classified post-war memo, "The American aircraft carrier is the most complex and successful machine yet created by man. It functions with the discipline of a state and the endurance of an industry." They concluded that no European power could hope to replicate it without first replicating the society that made it possible. That was perhaps the most profound lesson of all, that the aircraft carrier was not only an engineering triumph, but a cultural one. In the months that followed, U.S. carriers sailed into Tokyo Bay, their decks filled with aircraft gleaming in the sun. The Japanese surrender took place beneath their shadows, the floating cities that had carried America across half the world to victory. For German prisoners of war watching from newsreels, the sight was surreal. Massive steel islands anchored in calm water, flags waving, bands playing. They were looking at the future, and it belonged to their former enemies. In a single generation, naval warfare had transformed from battles of line and cannon to battles of coordination and reach. And in that transformation, the aircraft carrier had become not just a ship, but the living symbol of a new world order. When the war ended, German naval officers interviewed by Allied historians spoke with uncharacteristic awe. One said quietly, "They built factories that float. They wage war like an industry, not a crusade. And in doing so, they made the ocean their homeland." For them, the aircraft carrier represented the ultimate victory, not of weapons, but of systems, not of steel, but of structure. Where the Axis had sought dominance through destruction, the Allies had found it through endurance. The carrier had proven that mobility, organization, and unity could outlast ideology and brute force. And in that revelation, the German officers saw not only defeat, but a glimpse of the modern age. By the time the USS Missouri steamed into Tokyo Bay to accept Japan's surrender, the aircraft carrier was no longer just a naval tool. It was a civilization under sail, proof that the industrial world had learned to move, breathe, and fight as one. The German officers who stood aboard those ships as guests or prisoners did not yet know it, but they were witnessing the dawn of a new empire, one powered not by kings or empires but by logistics, technology, and the disciplined rhythm of democracy at sea. The battleships of the past had ruled through fear. The carriers of the future would rule through presence, and the world, once again, would never be the same. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the oceans, once symbols of conquest and division, had been reshaped by a new kind of power. Across the Pacific, from Okinawa to Pearl Harbor, American aircraft carriers lay at anchor, their decks empty now, their planes folded and silent. The war was over, but their presence told the story of how it had been won. For the Germans who lived through the last days of the Third Reich, reports of these floating cities seemed like fragments of another reality. Their world, and of rail networks, panzer divisions, and U-boats, had ended in ashes. Yet across the Atlantic, a new order had risen from steel, oil, and organization. The Americans had built more than weapons. They had built mobility. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Allied intelligence units systematically documented the reactions of German and Japanese officers who were exposed to captured Allied technology. Among the most detailed, accounts came from Operation Paperclip interviews, technical, interrogations conducted between 1945 and 1947. Many of those who had served in the Kriegsmarine, shipbuilders, naval architects, engineers, and were shown photographs, blueprints, and footage of American carrier operations. Their reactions were almost uniform: astonishment. They could not comprehend the logistics behind such a structure. How could a single nation produce, supply, and maintain fleets that functioned like self-contained metropolises on the sea? How could an empire of floating runways coordinate thousands of moving parts in perfect rhythm across half the globe? The answers lay not in any secret weapon, but in an organizational revolution. The United States had mobilized not just its navy, but its society. Every factory, every farm, every household had become part of the carrier's heartbeat. From the aluminum workers in Pittsburgh to the women riveting fuselages in California, every hand contributed to the rhythm that kept those decks alive. At its peak in 1945, the U.S. Navy operated over 110 aircraft carriers, supported by more than 6,000 auxiliary ships, tankers, tenders, transports, and repair vessels. The Navy had essentially become a maritime civilization, a mobile, global infrastructure powered by coordination and supply, and for German officers accustomed to a war of scarcity, where a few, destroyers or U-boats fought against impossible odds and the scale was incomprehensible. Captured Kriegsmarine officer, interviewed in London in late 1945, said simply, "We built ships. They built a world. That world remained afloat long after the war ended. The American carriers that had fought at Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Philippine Sea became the foundations of post-war power. They were refitted, rearmed, and redeployed, not just as instruments of combat, but as symbols of presence. By 1946, U.S. carriers were visiting European ports, their arrival drawing silent crowds. British, French, and German civilians watched as these massive ships, Enterprise, Saratoga, Essex, glided into harbors like floating skyscrapers. For nations still recovering from devastation, they represented both awe and unease. The carriers had transformed warfare, but now they were transforming geopolitics. They became ambassadors of a new Pax Americana, a global order policed not by colonies or conquests, but by mobility and reach. Wherever a carrier sailed, the flag it bore carried not just power, but permanence. For the German naval survivors allowed to tour them, it was an education in humility. In 1946, Allied officers arranged limited access for German engineers and strategists to observe the decommissioned USS Enterprise before it was retired. The Germans walked her decks like archaeologists exploring a lost civilization. They examined the arresting cables, the elevators, the flight deck patterns, and the living quarters. They noted the precision of the ship's internal organization, how repair teams were stationed by zone, how every compartment had emergency procedures pinned to the bulkhead. One of them, former naval architect Heinrich Seligmann, later wrote, "It was as if the ship had thought of every possibility: damage, hunger, sickness, even loneliness. It had systems for all things. It was not simply made to fight. It was made to endure." That word, endure, defined the difference between the Axis and the Allies. Germany had built weapons of brilliance but not longevity. America had built machines designed to survive time itself. For the average sailor aboard a U.S. carrier in 1945, the war's end felt anticlimactic. The same routines continued: meals served, decks cleaned, aircraft maintained. Men who had lived years in the rhythm of constant operation now found themselves drifting toward peace. But even in peace, the carriers remained in motion. They brought soldiers home from the Pacific, ferried supplies to occupied Japan, and delivered aid to starving civilians across Asia. One carrier captain, writing in his journal as his ship approached Yokosuka, reflected, "We have fought across the ocean and now we feed it. This ship was made for war, but perhaps she serves peace just as well." The German officers reading such words after the war understood the symbolism. These floating cities had outlived their original purpose, and in doing so they had redefined what power meant. In post-war Germany, naval reconstruction was forbidden, yet former officers continued to study American carriers as case studies in modern logistics. They analyzed not the armament, but the structure, the layered systems of command, supply, communication, and repair. The conclusion was unavoidable. American naval success had not been a miracle of technology, but the culmination of organization. The carrier embodied the principle that the Americans had perfected: decentralized efficiency. Every man had a role, but no man was irreplaceable. Every system was autonomous, but all systems supported one another. That lesson would influence generations of German engineers, who later applied the same principles to civilian industries, automotive assembly lines, communication networks, and logistics infrastructure. The spirit of the aircraft carrier, the world's first mobile, industrial society, had quietly seeded itself into the post-war world. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the carriers evolved. The Essex-class veterans of World War II became the foundation of the Cold War fleet. Jet aircraft replaced propeller planes. Radar became digital. Catapults became hydraulic. Yet the soul of the ship remained unchanged. A floating civilization, self-sufficient, disciplined, alive. The lessons learned from wartime carriers informed not only naval architecture but human organization. The integration of information, logistics, and adaptability, the carrier's true weapons, became the blueprint for the modern military and even corporate systems. By the early 1950s, the carrier was no longer a weapon of necessity. It was the embodiment of presence. Wherever it appeared, it represented a kind of mobile sovereignty. For the Germans who had once dreamed of ruling the seas, this new reality was sobering. During post-war debriefings, Admiral Karl Dönitz, the last commander of the Kriegsmarine, admitted that his U-boat strategy, revolutionary in 1940, had been rendered obsolete by American logistics. He noted bitterly that the U.S. Navy could lose a dozen ships in a month and replace them before the next tide. "We fought the enemy ships," he said, "but not his factories." When shown post-war footage of American carriers launching aircraft in continuous waves, he sat silent for a long moment before saying, "It is not a ship. It is an argument, and that argument, in that mobility, endurance, and coordination would outlast firepower, became the central truth of post-war warfare." In the years that followed, American carriers became stages for diplomacy, rescue, and deterrence. They brought aid to earthquake zones, evacuated refugees, launched reconnaissance flights, and served as mobile hospitals. The same decks that once carried bombers now launched helicopters with food and medicine. To the rest of the world, the aircraft carrier symbolized not just American dominance, but the transformation of warfare itself, from destruction to projection, from conquest to presence. To the Germans watching from a divided nation, that transformation was deeply ironic. The very machines that had helped destroy their ambitions were now instruments of global stability, patrolling seas that no one nation could ever again claim. The cultural impact reached beyond strategy. Photographs of American carriers circulated through post-war Europe, black and white images of vast decks, radar masts, and crew parades stretching to the horizon. They became icons of the modern age, the fusion of human discipline and industrial complexity. In Germany's rebuilding universities, naval architects taught carrier logistics as models of large-scale system design. The concept of organized redundancy, multiple fail-safes ensuring continuous operation, became a foundation for post-war engineering. From transportation networks to energy grids, the idea of the carrier as a living system influenced more than ships. It became a metaphor for the modern world. Yet beneath the admiration, there lingered something else: melancholy. For many Axis veterans, the sight of those ships was a reminder not only of defeat, but of possibility. They saw what might have been, had their own nations chosen industry over ideology, cooperation over control. A former Luftwaffe officer, after touring USS Midway in 1947, remarked to a British correspondent, "They built cities to fight us. We built myths." It was a brutal summary of the difference between the two wars being fought, one of machines and organization, the other of belief and ambition. The war had ended, but the aircraft carrier had only just begun its reign. In the coming decades, it would define every major conflict: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, and shape the geopolitics of an entire century. It would become the centerpiece of strategy, diplomacy, and deterrence, and its origins guide the innovation, the discipline, the endless repetition aboard those steel decks, traced back to the same principles that had once left German officers speechless in 45. They had seen the future and realized it was already built. By the time the year 1950s dawned, America's carriers had outgrown the war that birthed them. They were no longer tools of combat, but engines of influence. Their presence projected security, not destruction. The sight of one gliding through gray morning mist became a symbol of the modern age. Massive, silent, and inevitable. For those who had fought against them, it was a reminder that wars are not always won by courage or strategy alone. They are won by systems that can outlast chaos, by machines that carry civilization itself. And that was the true triumph of the aircraft carrier. It had begun as a steel experiment. It ended as the floating embodiment of an idea that industrial order could master the wildest element on Earth, the sea. Germany's admirals had once dreamed of ruling the oceans through strength. America did it through structure. And in that silent exchange, as the last great battleships rusted away, the future of warfare and of civilization changed forever. In the years after the war, the aircraft carrier ceased to be merely a weapon. It became a statement, a moving continent of order, technology, and willpower. Wherever it sailed, it carried the idea that modern civilization could exist even in the most hostile corners of the earth. For the German officers who once looked upon these ships with disbelief, that realization came with quiet awe. The world they had known, one ruled by artillery, armor, and ideology, had been replaced by something more enduring. The war had proven that victory no longer belonged to the strongest or the boldest, but to those who could organize complexity, who could turn industry into discipline, and discipline into motion. The aircraft carrier was the embodiment of that truth. It was not built on myth or conquest, but on systems. Generators humming like heartbeats, crews working in rhythm, intelligence guiding every move. It represented a kind of order that mirrored the very idea of modernity itself: coordinated, continuous, adaptable. Long after the guns stopped, these floating cities remained at sea, quiet and vigilant, symbols of a new century. They were reminders that the same structures which sustain war can also sustain peace, that precision, endurance, and cooperation, once forged in battle, could be turned toward stability. When those German officers stood on American carrier decks in 1945, surrounded by the hum of machinery and the calm of men who understood their craft, they weren't just witnessing the end of a war. They were witnessing the dawn of a new civilization, one that ruled not through fear, but through mastery of organization and time. The battleships had once embodied power. The carriers had redefined it. In their steel shadows, the modern world was born, an age where oceans were no longer barriers but foundations of presence. And though those floating cities of war were built to fight, they carried within them something greater, the enduring proof that even amid destruction, humanity could build order upon chaos and civilization upon the sea.